I just told him I am an independent woman, and he decided to stop paying and forced me to get a job. I thought I was making the right decision when I cheated on my husband. I didn't see then what exactly I was doing, and I thought, well, I guess I wasn't exactly thinking when I made that decision, and now all I'm left with is bucket loads of regrets and emptiness inside me. Hello, Reddit. My name is Catherine, and I'm 34 years old. I was married to John, my husband, for 10 years before I, destroyed everything with my own careless actions. I met John through a cousin of mine who set us up. It was a blind date, and we clicked almost immediately because, believe me, John was a sweet talker. We started meeting often, and after a month of knowing each other, we started dating. We dated for a year before we eventually got married. Long before I met John, I had always believed myself to be independent, and I projected that into any relationship I had in the past so that no man would treat me wrongly. I guess I got that mindset from my parents' marriage. My dad was an all-talk, no-action kind of man. Well, the only action he did was hitting my mother. They had a shotgun marriage because Mom got pregnant with me, and her father, who was my grandfather, was a strict man who didn't want any grandchildren out of wedlock. So yeah, they had gotten married almost immediately after Granddad found out. The one thing I ever hated about Granddad was forcing my parents to be together and insisting that marriage was a till death do you part affair, when all their lives, and eventually their children's lives, were filled with bitterness and lots of pent-up anger. But other than that, I guess old age being one of the factors, Granddad was a very sweet old man and was the only source of love I looked up to. My dad died of a heart attack when I was barely 19, freeing my mother from his claws. I didn't want that for myself. I wanted freedom even while married or in any relationship I found myself in. Most men didn't understand that, so they thought I came across as rude and arrogant instead of what I would usually think of as independence. So they left before the relationship even advanced at all. I didn't mind. I was strongly determined that a man would have to accept my strong will. I wasn't going to bow to any man and allow him to treat me however he might like. Because of that, I had only one boyfriend before I met John and eventually married him. His name was Wilson. Wilson was almost obsessed with me, so it was easy to have him do my bidding. And because Wilson was quite wealthy, he spoiled me with different gifts and expensive things. Anything I wanted was mine so long as I asked, and I did indeed ask. I was the one who ended the relationship because I was getting too tired of having my way with everything, and he was always apologizing. He was just too easy, and I took advantage of that. When I met John, he owned a small automobile company where he sold cars and also fixed the spoiled ones. He was outspoken but yet listened well to my opinions, and I enjoyed our conversations and even our banter. It was very easy to fall in love with him. I didn't go to college because Dad had died by the time I was supposed to, and Mom hadn't been working originally. She was a full-time housewife, so it was difficult to get by. I had to drop out and support Mom in fending for my siblings and me. I held different part-time jobs at the time so I could really take the load off Mom and also support my siblings through school. When I dated Wilson, he was the one spending the money, so I dropped some part-time jobs and only worked 2. But when I met John and got married to him, I stopped working altogether and became a full-time housewife. At first, John didn't mind supporting me and my siblings. In fact, he was the most supportive husband ever. But then John's business took a hit. His business partners pulled out of the business, saying they wanted to start investing in another type of business. John was not himself for weeks, and then he got back up. He started to look for other business partners, but none was forthcoming. In fact, he even went to get a loan from the bank and used our home as mortgage so he would be able to obtain the loan. John became more tight-handed with his money. At first I understood it was because he was going through a lot, but then even after his business finally bounced back and was even bigger and better than before, he just became stingy and wouldn't even give me money. He did though, but not as much as he did before. And when I did ask, he would tell me we had to save up and be careful with how we spent money. I was upset with how he was behaving and was starting to get irritated with his callous attitude. One time, Mary, a friend of mine from childhood, invited me to her party. Mary had always been a bully right from childhood. I don't mean she exactly used violent means, but her sassy mouth did the job. She had always looked down on me because I hadn't gone to college. Back then, whenever she came home from college, she would purposely pick the places I did part-time jobs to buy things, and would sometimes whisper some things to her friends' ears, and they would both laugh. It didn't take much to know they were laughing at me. So when I had gotten married to John, I'm sure she hadn't believed her ears, because it would be impossible in her mind that a girl who doesn't have anything could get married to a rich guy. The bullying stopped. She even stopped speaking to me for a while. Until that day, we had bumped into each other at a grocery store, and I had been grumbling bitterly about the little amount of money John had given me to shop with when I saw her. I changed and started to pick even unnecessary things and put them in my basket, pretending I didn't see her. She was the one who walked up to me and greeted me first. I pretended to be surprised when I saw her, and she pretended we'd always been good friends right from childhood because she kissed both my cheeks, and that did shock me. She told me she had a housewarming party and wanted to invite me to the party. I smiled then, pretending to, and asked her what the dress code was. Her words were to dress casually. Believe me, I know Mary. Her own casual meant getting a little dressy. So after she had left, I quickly removed the things I didn't need, bought the things I needed exactly, and went back home. That day, John came back home really late, and because I was waiting for him, I had slept off while waiting. He carried me to the bedroom, and I didn't even move a muscle and slept till morning. By the time I was awake the next day, I saw a note beside me in bed. Apparently, John was going on a business trip, and he had to travel by road, and since he had to get there early, he left the house really early. I was really pissed because I wanted to talk to him to give me some money so I could get the right and expensive dress for Mary's party. It was 2 days until Mary's party before John was back home. It was obvious that he was tired and grumpy from his road trip, but I couldn't let the discussion wait another minute because I didn't want to rush while having to shop a day before the party. So I told him I needed some money, and I told him the reason why I needed the money. But John flared up. He accused me of not caring about him. He said after 3 whole days of being gone on the business trip, I only called to ask when he was back home, and not how the business was going. He even said he had gone on the trip hoping to expand more and went for a meeting with a potential investor. But the investor backed out, so that meant his business trip wasn't successful. And that when he had come home, he expected his own wife to even ask how the business trip went. But instead, the reason why I had even been calling was to ask for money because I wanted to buy clothes for some party. I tried to even explain why I needed to buy the clothes, especially since it was Mary's party, but John wasn't even listening to me and just continued ranting, saying how dependent I was on him and how I wasn't contributing to anything. I became very angry and shouted back at him, saying some things I now very much regret. Among those things, the one that stood out and I remember very clearly because it was the beginning of my nemesis. As I said earlier, I was angry, and just because I told him I was an independent woman, he stopped paying and forced me to get a job. Yes, John threatened that he would stop paying for anything in the house, and in fact, he did just that. He started and forced me to go get a job. I had said I was independent because I felt he had no right to tell me what to do, even though I was married to him. But that clearly had made John angry. I couldn't go to Mary's party. I gave excuses of being very ill and expressed my regrets for not showing up. The following week, John kept true to his word. He refused to pay for anything and would ask that I made my own contributions to it. I eventually had to give in, and he, being satisfied, helped me secure a receptionist job at his friend's company. We started sharing the bills of everything in the house. The only thing I wasn't paying for was my siblings' fees. John said that he would take that responsibility. This continued until our 6th year of being married. I was so tired of working. The job and pay weren't pleasant, and I had to meet different kinds of people on the job. One time I was slapped for refusing to let a very obnoxious woman go see the boss because she had no appointment. Another time, I had to step between 2 ladies fighting over who was going to go up first. I had stepped in to break the fight, but sadly, I was turned into the punching bag. Whenever I complained to John about all this, all he said was sorry and that I should endure until he got me a new job. He didn't understand what I meant. I wanted to stop working in general. I was tired of being ordered around and then coming home tired and stressed out. All this continued until I met an old-time friend of mine. Rose. Rose was the only girl who spoke to me without criticizing me for being the girl in our age group who dropped out of high school. She was my friend, and we shared everything. Though her parents were well-to-do and they often gave Rose money to give us sometimes, when I dropped out, Rose's parents offered to pay for my tuition fees. I was exhilarated and told my mom about the offer, but my mom refused. She didn't want pity, she said. So when Rose eventually left for college, I was left alone by myself, except when she came around with stories of college and their boys there. So I usually looked forward to her visits because she helped fill my imagination with how college would feel like. But Rose's parents moved out of town, and I couldn't see Rose again. When Rose came back to town and intended to settle there, we met up and became friends again, while filling each other in on the parts of our lives we had missed out on. Rose was also married with 2 kids. She came back to settle with her husband, who wanted to start up a business there. She also worked through her transfer from where she had previously worked so she could work with the branch that was here. She was one of the managing directors of one of the largest hotels, and even in our small town, the hotel was the largest and most magnificent building, so I was really pleased for her, maybe a little jealous. But you cannot blame me. She had a husband who didn't care whether she worked or not, and he paid all the bills. She went to college, graduated, and worked in one of the biggest hotels, and she had 2 beautiful kids. Who wouldn't want to have those things, especially since my life wasn't exactly pleasant? I wasn't exactly what you'd call happy. So when I complained about my job as a receptionist, she offered me the position of manager at the hotel she worked at. I was so happy because it was a wild dream come true. I told John about it, and he wasn't as excited as I thought he would be for me. I had to start living in the staff quarters of the hotel because of the hotel policy, and John wasn't comfortable with that, even after I assured him that on my 2 days off, I would come home and spend time with him. The hotel policy was that we got 2 days break in 2 weeks, but since everyone couldn't go all at once, it was rotated so that only a few staff members were missing at work, which still would not affect the system. Now that I think about it, he was being reasonable when he didn't want me to work there. But back then, I just wanted to be independent and also prove to myself that I could make money to buy myself anything I wanted without having to hear complaints about how unnecessary the things I was buying were. And then again, I thought he was only saying things like that because he wasn't the one who got me the job. So within a week, I had moved to the staff quarters, and Rose herself helped me settle in and get familiar with the place, staff, and the rules and regulations. The first few weeks weren't exactly easy. In fact, on my days off, I couldn't go home because I had so much documentation I needed to do, and also needed to coordinate the staff so they got used to my style of doing things. After a month of working there, I was getting the hang of things, and usually John was always calling to check on me and ask me how things were with work. I went to visit home for the first time since I got the job, and John was really excited to see me. It was like old times when John and I were still dating. John treated me like a princess. He must have missed me as much as I missed him. I was really reminded of all the things I loved about John during the 2-day break, and I reluctantly went back to work. I loved working there, honestly, but I liked seeing my husband more. After about 6 months working at the hotel, John and I fell into a routine. The 2-day breaks were usually the time I looked forward to because we had become long-distance lovers, and so the limited time we had together wasn't spent arguing or talking about money problems, but just for our happy hour. When it was a full year of working at the hotel, I got pregnant. I was surprised, then I became unhappy. It meant my work at the hotel might have to stop, and it also meant going back home to John and us having problems again, problems we hadn't had since I started working there, and I didn't want that. I was confused and went to Rose for advice. She asked me what I wanted to do about the situation because she couldn't decide for me. I was desperate in my thinking. I couldn't have a baby. I hadn't yet made the money I wanted to make to buy myself certain things, and then again, there was the John factor. I hadn't told him about the baby, but instinctively, I knew if I told him, he'd convince me to keep the baby and quit my job and come back home. So I did the only thing I thought was wise at that point. I aborted the baby. When Rose asked me what my decision was, I told her I had aborted the baby and lied that my husband was also aware and had approved of the abortion. I felt guilty, but I eventually waved it off. I thought at the time that it was for the best, so I continued working there as a manager. That was until I met him. He had come to the hotel as a special VIP, and we had been instructed to make sure he was really comfortable at the hotel. I went out of my way to ensure that the suite was cleaned and arranged to his taste, and I was the one who received the guest. I honestly hadn't thought about the guest coming because I thought I was just doing my job until I saw who had walked in through the doors. It was Wilson, my first boyfriend. I wasn't expecting him to show up there. In fact, I hadn't given him any thought since I broke up with him. I felt really embarrassed that I had to eventually be the one to attend to him. I knew he was rich, but I didn't know he would become that wealthy, to the point of being treated almost like royalty. When Wilson saw me, a look of surprise crossed his face, especially when he saw me welcoming him with the customary smile I had on, and stating what a delight it was to have him at our hotel, despite the fact that I was clearly not feeling that way on the inside. But I had to keep my job, so I just smiled and showed him to his suite. It was particularly hurtful when Wilson pretended he didn't know me. I would have even been sure he didn't, with the way he acted, except for the fact that he had a look of surprise on his face when he had entered and saw me. I wasn't happy, but I couldn't do anything about the situation, so I just did my job, escorted him, and left quietly with, "If you need anything, sir, please let me know by ringing for me." I was even more sure that Wilson was deliberately ignoring me and pretending not to know me when, for the next 2 days since he arrived, he would particularly ring for me and ask me to do something he could easily do or ask one of the staff other than the manager to get done. I knew he knew that when I had said if he needed anything, he could call me. I was saying something very important, not meaningless errands. The 3rd day since he arrived, it was finally my day off, and I was pleased I could leave work and go home. In fact, John had offered to pick me up that day, and I had been excited. But Wilson had called for me, and I had sent my assistant to tell him that it was my day off and that he could ask her instead for anything he wanted. But she was back a few minutes later and said he insisted he wanted me to be the one that attended to him. I knew he was just looking for trouble, and I was beginning to get pissed at that point. I called John and told him work came up, and I couldn't come home that day as planned. I changed back quickly into my work outfit and went to see Wilson. When I got there, Wilson had been in the bathtub, and he insisted I bring him his robe. I was very upset and just grabbed the robe, and when I tried to hand it over to him without looking, he pulled me into the bathtub, and because I hadn't been expecting it, I landed right on top of him. I was soaked and in my uniform. Before I could say anything else, Wilson had started to kiss me, and truly, at first, I hadn't resisted because I was too shocked, but when I regained my senses, I pushed him off, which was kind of difficult as he was slippery with soap, and so was getting out of the tub. I was very angry with him for what he did, and I shouted at him, telling him if he knew the implication of what he had done. I was married, and also it was against company policy to be involved with a guest at the hotel. Wilson insisted he didn't mind all that, and that he had never gotten over me even after I ended the relationship. When he saw me, he saw it as an opportunity to be with me again, until he saw the wedding band on my finger. He had at first been livid, but hearing I was going home for my day off and obviously back to my husband just made his blood boil, and he couldn't bear the thought of another man having the right to touch me. All he said that day made absolutely no sense to me, and I just angrily left his suite. Luckily for me, I had 2 extra uniforms, so I quickly changed into another one. Wilson didn't ring for me again throughout that day, and instead had other staff do it. It kind of made me uneasy because his words were repeating over and over in my head, even though I didn't want them to. Thinking about him became more and more frequent because he still wasn't asking for me 3 days later, and I knew he was scheduled to leave the following week. I knew I had to talk to him and clear the air, but because he wasn't asking for me, it had me frustrated and somehow desperate to talk to him. The opportunity came when he requested my assistant, who fortunately was on leave that day, so I went in her stead. When Wilson saw it was me, he didn't speak at first and just stared at me, and I knew I was supposed to say something. The speech I had had enough time to prepare in my head just flew off, and I was stammering. Wilson came to me and just kissed me instead. This time, even though I knew I shouldn't have, I kissed him back, and that day, we had sex. I know, it was all shades of wrong, and I had a million reasons why I shouldn't have done that. I had a happy marriage, a husband who loved me, and a job that paid my bills, but I just didn't know why I did that with Wilson. I regret my decision that day every day now. I didn't exactly stop there, though. Because of me, or let me say because of our affair, Wilson extended his stay for another 3 weeks, and we were together nearly all the time. He spoiled me silly with expensive gifts, and sometimes I would have dinner in his room if I had the chance, and mostly it was sex that was constant. My next day off, I didn't go home either and gave John excuses of work again. Meanwhile, I spent it with Wilson. He took me out, and I had a shopping spree and bought anything and everything I wanted. Dinners at top-star restaurants outside of town, and crazy long hours of sex. I thought then that I was having the time of my life, living without thinking of the consequences. But then it was the week for the staff review. It was done yearly, and participated in by all the staff, and also done anonymously so that no staff risked being scared of saying anything that would have them fired. Well, guess whose affair was in most of the staff's review? It was mine, in case you didn't guess correctly. Apparently the staff knew I had been sneaking around with Wilson while he was a guest in our hotel. How did I know? It was because Rose was the one that the whole review was submitted to, and she had called me, hurt that I was doing that kind of thing, especially as a married woman. She said because I had gone against company rules, I either had to quit the job myself or risk being fired, and she was only doing me the courtesy of telling me because I was her friend. She even advised me to stop the affair if the rumors were true. I was angry then. I knew she was giving me the right advice and saying all the right things, but I just was angry that she hadn't supported me or asked me why I was having an affair, so I just left her place and went directly to Wilson's suite. I told him what was said, and he asked me to quit instead. He convinced me I was a queen that needed to be treated right. He told me I didn't need to work anymore because he was going to take good care of me. So I followed his advice and quit my job. When I first went home, John had been very surprised to see me, especially since it wasn't yet my day off, so I lied and told him that I had missed him. So I exchanged my day off with someone else so I could come home. John was very happy to see me, and I felt really guilty, but despite the fact that my affair had only gone on for a month, I had already started getting used to the lifestyle Wilson had me living. So when my day off was over, I went back to work when I actually went with Wilson on a trip. I enjoyed myself so much, having people at my beck and call and buying the luxurious things I had only ever dreamt of. I had to eventually go back home on my pretend day off. John had prepared me dinner and even added candles to make it more romantic. It was really cute, but I was getting used to dining in grand style. I didn't even appreciate the effort he put in to make me a nicely cooked dinner when I knew originally that John was a terrible cook. He must have taken a few lessons to have been able to cook that for me, but I didn't even care at that point. I just ate a little and went to bed. The next day I went out to shop with the money Wilson gave me because we were planning another trip to a different state, and I wanted to dress to impress. When I got home, I saw John standing by my things, looking them over with a surprised look on his face. My heart had skipped a beat and began racing because I didn't know at that moment what I wanted to tell him. So when he noticed my presence, especially with a shopping bag in hand with the name of the most expensive mall in town written largely on it, he gave me a puzzled look and then silently walked to the kitchen. I had dropped the bag and followed him, and before he said anything, I started to lie and tell him most of them were from Rose, and then I saved up to get some too from my salary. John didn't say anything again about it and just ignored me. I was anxious and scared he would find out. Despite the fact that Wilson was spoiling me silly, I still loved John and feared losing him. The next day, I told him I was going back to work, and he still wasn't saying anything. I was worried about his silence because I couldn't read whatever he was feeling. I went with Wilson out of town again, and despite all the money he was squandering on me, my mind was still unsettled because there was the thought of John in my mind. So I made excuses of being a little ill and asked that we return back home. I went home and met John in our room, his head between his hands, and one of his hands had a paper in it. When I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with such anger in his eyes and handed me the paper in his hand. Confused, I read through the paper and suddenly went cold. It was the signed agreement to approve that I wanted to get an abortion done, and that it was both partners who decided it. I had forged John's signature. Before I could say anything, John was already talking. Apparently, the hospital decided to mail us the signed document for some reason, and upon seeing it, he had gone to my workplace only to find out I quit, instead of being fired for disobeying hotel rules of no involvement with guests. I was really shocked. All my secrets were out in the open, and there was nothing I could cover it up with. John said he wanted me out of his house and that he wanted a divorce. I tried apologizing and explaining why I did the things I did, but John wasn't listening to me and gave me a day to get my things out. The next week after the whole incident, I had to rent an apartment with the money I had left with me after I left John's place, and I was really devastated. Wilson called me and asked me to go on a trip, but I refused. I wasn't feeling up to it, as I was still looking for ways to apologize to John, as he had refused to take my calls or respond to any of my texts. But Wilson kept insisting, saying he had a surprise for me, and I had to be there, so I had no choice but to go. It was an all-expense-paid trip per usual, and when I arrived there expecting the surprise, he told me it was planned for the next day. So he gave me his card to shop and buy whatever I wanted, and especially a beautiful dress for the surprise the next day. I became really curious as to what the surprise might be, so I shopped and bought myself the most gorgeous dress I could find, and it was definitely the most expensive. I was getting excited for what Wilson had in store for me the next day. The next day, Wilson had sent staff up to my quarters to help me get dressed, and another person was waiting to take me to the venue of the surprise when I was done. I was confused when he brought me to a large church, filled to the brim with people, and asked me to sit in the front pew. I wasn't expecting the surprise in a church, or for there to be so many people to witness it. Well, that was until I heard the wedding song playing solemnly in the background, and everyone standing on their feet, turning to face the back with smiles on their faces. Confused, I stood up with them, and what I saw made me freeze. Wilson was grinning ear to ear and wearing a suit, and on his arm was his bride, who was smiling happily. The surprise was Wilson's wedding. Wilson had brought me to his wedding, and I was forced to watch the whole thing because I couldn't exactly leave when there were cameras, and I was sitting at the front pew, so running out wasn't even an option. I sat through the wedding, and eventually, when I got a chance alone with Wilson, he smiled and asked if I enjoyed the surprise. I had been so upset I wanted to hit him, but he held my hand and told me some things that made me go cold. Apparently, I had been the first woman to treat him like a fool and eventually dump him, so when he saw me again, he felt it was an opportunity to get revenge, and I actually made it easy by falling directly into his arms. He was the one who mailed that signed document to my husband because he had people investigate me, and they found that out. He convinced me to quit my job so I could be jobless, and then my husband, finding out about my affair, would leave me alone and empty. He refused to pay for my trip back home, so I had to do that myself with the rest of the money I had. I'm so unhappy and sad. I betrayed my husband over nothing. I'm really sad and feeling empty. Please, guys, what do I do? I need advice on how to get my home back, please. Update. Hello, Reddit. I'm so sad and really unhappy about everything. I thought if I came here to express myself, that maybe somehow someone would sympathize with me and perhaps give me some advice on what I had to do to win John back. But instead, all I got was backlash and hate comments. I know and regret everything I did, and since I've had time to reflect on the things I did, I regret more than ever everything I did to John. I was so stupid and thoughtless, and I cannot begin to imagine how John stayed married to me for that long. I lost my marriage over material things, and worse, an affair that eventually led to embarrassment. I don't even have anyone to talk to because even Rose refused to speak to me. John wouldn't take my calls or respond to my texts. The only thing I got from him was my remaining luggage and the divorce papers mailed to me. I'm so doomed. Now I'm in between jobs more than ever. I couldn't even keep up with the rent of my apartment, and I had to move somewhere smaller. I cannot even begin to express how awful I feel. It's terrible what I did, and I regret everything I've done. Wilson's marriage was top news, and everywhere I went, people seemed to be talking about it. It's been really hard for me. My stupidity has just brought me my doom. Mary saw me at one of my part-time jobs, and it was high school all over again, the sneering and mockery. John was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I lost that over something as stupid as cheating and material things that are now in Maggie's store for half the price. The money I got from the clothes I sold, I used to pay for my siblings' fees, because I'm all they have now. I cannot even get a proper job because I lack qualifications. The life I was so used to is now all gone, sadly. I know I'll always regret losing John and destroying what we had because of my own greediness. When he told me to get a job, I saw now what he was trying to do. He was teaching me responsibility, being responsible with money. Back then, I had thought that since I took care of my mom and siblings, I knew what it was like to be responsible. But clearly I didn't, because immediately I saw the opportunity to spend money how I liked, I jumped at it, and eventually, it caused my doom. Update. Hello Reddit, this is my last post here. Just wanted to express my gratitude for being able to at least express myself here, despite the backlash in comments. I still am thankful I got to share what I was feeling. It doesn't make me feel better as I type, but it's still worse because it reminds me of the bad things I've done, and things I could have done better. I hope that at least someone learned something from my story. It never pays to cheat on your partner regardless. Take me, for example.